being crisis ready means that your entire team can identify a rising risk in real time, is trained to understand and to assess properly the material impact that it presents to the organization. So is it an issue versus is it a potential crisis? And then can respond in a way that doesn't just manage the incident, but manages it in a way that fosters increased trust and credibility in the brand. And that's where that lens of, if you are crisis ready, you have built brand invincibility, because it means that you can withstand or weather any type of negative event that may strike your organization or your business in a way that you walk out of it with even more trust and credibility built up with those who matter most to your business.
You're listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with your host, Michael Palmer. Listen each week as inspiring guests share their secrets of success to help you increase your confidence, work smarter, and build a business you love. This episode of The Successful Bookkeeper is brought to you by PureBookkeeping.com, the proven system to grow your bookkeeping business.
Welcome back to the Successful Bookkeeper podcast. I am your host, Michael Palmer, and today's show is going to be a good one. Our guest is the leading authority on crisis preparedness, reputation management, and brand protection. She is a coveted speaker, commentator, and advisor to some of today's leading organizations faced with the greatest risk. Melissa Agnes, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Michael. It is my pleasure and honor to be here.
It's so great to have you. And, you seem to be all over the place advising people, all sorts of organizations, big and small, but at a global level. And I think it's such an opportunity for our listeners to hear what you've been up to for your career and helping small businesses get prepared for what risk may be coming at their businesses. But before we get into some of these questions, tell us about your career leading up to this point.
Oh, leading up to this point. Okay, so I have been an entrepreneur my entire adult life. And I started off, oh my goodness, it's kind of embarrassing. I started off doing photo montages for senior people where I lost more money than I made on every sale, back in the day when I was very young and just starting off. But you know what? It led to where I am today. So from that led to a digital kind of online agency that focused on branding and social media and website development and different things for the digital realm for brands. And one thing to note, I suppose, about me is the way that my brain works and has always worked for as long as I can remember is I see risk everywhere. And then it takes on this pattern. So I see risk, I see mitigation strategies for risk, and then I see opportunity through that mitigation. That's kind of, if I were to put my brain into a linear fashion to describe it, that's the way that it has always kind of just played out. And so back almost 10 years ago now, I was doing social media strategies right at the cusp of, in time when brands were just figuring out that they could use social, that they should use social, that it presented all of these wonderful opportunities. And from there, I remember one morning doing my morning reading, and it just struck me, why is nobody talking about all of the risk of technology, of the digital landscape, of, real-time communication, 24/7 news cycle, two-way communication, all of these different factors that were becoming very, very prevalent in, businesses day to day. And then through that, of course, my brain went to, if we understand these risks, we can mitigate them. And then on top of that, through the mitigation, there's all of these wonderful opportunities that are unprecedented to actually communicate with our stakeholders in times of need. And so that kind of triggered something within me, which led to about a year of studying, learning everything that I could on the topic of crisis management, which before that point in time, I didn't realize was a thing. And yet I discovered this thing that just really, really resonated with the person and the human, the way that I'm made up. And at the same time, I also realized that nobody was talking about all of these, the digital components of all of this, which I kept turning to my business partner at one point saying, there's something here, there's something here, there's something here. I just don't know exactly what it is. And then one morning, I get a call from one of my clients, which was a real estate investment trust. We had just launched their website, and the VP called me very, very early saying, in a panic, saying, our president's in the car with a prospective investor. The radio is reporting that one of our buildings is about to explode. Our investors are very concerned. They're thinking of withdrawing their money. It's not true. It's total rumor. Apparently, this rumor started on Twitter. We have no idea what Twitter is, but we hear it's a digital thing. And since you just launched our website, we thought to call you. Can you help us? Right person to call. I walked in within a half an hour. I had the media correcting themselves. I had, the right information streamlining to investors. Anyways, long story short, I had the president of the company called me the next morning thanking me, saying not only did our unit price not go down since yesterday, it actually went up a cent. So thank you so much. And that was my moment of, oh my goodness, I know what my purpose is in this world. I had no idea where it would take me. I had no idea to what extent this was my purpose, but it was the catalyst for this career path. And I jumped.
Wow.
I jumped, started a blog. Mine was the first in the world to really start addressing really big issues and thoughts and ideas and concepts that I felt businesses, professionals needed to be raising, and they weren't. And right place, right time. It kind of picked up from there.
Wow. That's such an interesting story. I mean, the backstory, how it came to be, and then really ultimately being put to the test where you actually created such an economic difference. I mean, you said 1 cent. I imagine that 1 cent meant a lot of money to somebody.
It did.
But why do you think no one was thinking about this or talking about it?
I think, when I'm fluttering, it's a good question. I have two kind of answers that I can give. One is when I started blogging, mine was the first to start really addressing these issues. Or I was the first, and I'm very, very prevalent online. So when there's something to think about or to talk about or to raise, I raise it. And I've always been like that. And I remember when I started the blog, I had many long-standing crisis management professionals that were nearing retirement came to me and said, we found your work. We absolutely agree that these are issues. We don't necessarily know if this whole digital thing is a fad or a trend or, how long it's going to last. And we're nearing retirement, so we don't necessarily want to learn it. But we are smart enough to know that our clients need your services now. Can we partner? So there was one component there about, it just those who were doing it didn't see it the way that I did. It just happened to be that way. And then the other component was, I remember when I first started, the reason that my business has always been primarily American is because even the Americans were more receptive to it. So I remember sitting down with businesses in Canada, which I'm Canadian, so that's where I was living, and they would look at me and say, Canadian companies don't have crises. So there was this mindset of being closed off to anything. Nobody wanted to look at the risk of anything. And that's what I do is I look at the risk, I prevent the preventable, and I help organizations prepare and be ready for the unpreventable. Americans were more receptive to that, but I was also a little bit that's why I was the first, right? So I was a little bit ahead of the curve. I saw something coming that people weren't ready necessarily to see yet. So I basically created a marketplace of one, as a friend of mine would say, and that made it extra difficult. Today it's easier. People see the risk everywhere and they realize how prevalent it is, and they realize that they're not ready for it, the smart ones anyways. Whereas before I was kind of creating this market where I saw a need, but they didn't necessarily know or realize that this need existed and pertained to them yet.
Beautiful. Well, I think that our listeners, there's probably a lot of listeners that are doing a fist pump right now in the air going, yes, someone else is looking at these things, because often it's, people don't pay attention to things until they absolutely have to. And then often it's too late. And so, I think our listeners as bookkeepers it's part of what they do is looking for the black and white in situations, and making sure that it's eyes wide open, and really looking at what the truth is, what the reality is, and then preparing for that and dealing with whatever that might be.
Well, I mean, absolutely. And as bookkeepers, you do such a service for your clients just in preventing risk. When you do your job well, you mitigate risk for your clients, and risk that is preventable. So therefore, no excuse, right? From the client's perspective, and does wonders in letting them sleep easier at night. Of all of it, risk mitigation. So 100%, I agree.
There's more fist pumping happening. Awesome. And so this came up, you had this aha moment really, and economic wow for a client. And then now it's taken you all over the world. What's that journey been like?
It's been wonderful. I love my job. It's funny, my little sister, who is 19, came and stayed with me in New York last week. It was her first time. And I spent the whole week with her. I did about an average of 2 hours a day on work. And as much as I love and adore her, she's one of my favorite humans on this planet. I missed my work. So I really, really, really love what I do. So that's, it's been wonderful. But I don't know how I started. So I can remember the precise moment when I knew that this was my path. This was my calling, if you will. I don't remember the precise moment that I decided to be a public speaker. I do remember a moment in grade 8 winning an award giving a speech, and having this feeling within me, or this knowledge within me, that one day I would do this. But I don't remember how that actually developed to be. I just know that I started one day and I love it, and I continue. So
Beautiful.
It's the speaking that takes me around the world. And then it's the advisory work that I do for clients sometimes takes me to travel, depending on the client. But a lot of that is I'm tapped into virtually.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting, your background. You said that you see risk, and you see this. It's like this way about you throughout your life. Do you see where there were places in your life that showed you how to actually take this on and handle them?
More and more, I'm starting to realize in the last about 6 to 8 months, I've really started to realize how much crisis readiness, everything that I teach, everything that I do with clients, everything that's in my book is really, really who I am, and always has been since I was a kid. So it's interesting. I mean, it's interesting to me. So for example, I often talk about identifying your high risk scenarios. So every single business, I don't care if you're, a solopreneur straight through to the biggest brand in the world, there are a handful of high risk scenarios. So most likely high impact events that can strike your organization that you're the most prone or vulnerable to. Every single business has, whether it's 2 or 3 or a dozen of these high risk scenarios that pertain to them. And then I go into my work that I do as an advisor, as well as where I take people throughout the book, is diving into those high-risk scenarios and preventing the preventable and planning effectively for the unpreventable so that you are crisis ready. And all of that to say, to answer your question, to bring it back full circle, about nearly a year ago, my husband and I got divorced. And I realized today that we were together for 12 beautiful years. And throughout that relationship, because I was preparing us. So when you're in a relationship, one of your high-risk scenarios are split. Right? Splitting up. It's a high risk scenario if you want to look at it through that lens. Mm-hmm. And I was doing things throughout that relationship to enable us, help us be crisis ready for that potential risk one day if it were to materialize. And as a result, and things like setting tone or addressing it, talking about it in advance, telling him things like, I hope that I don't conform. I have a strong thing with that. And I was saying to him that if one day we aren't in love anymore, I hope that we are strong enough to, hug each other, wish each other well, and leave each other, right? Not stay where we're not happy. And that's exactly what happened. And when not that we weren't happy anymore, we just weren't in love anymore. But when it happened, I was able to call back on those things, those, seeds that I had planted throughout the relationship and say things to him that enabled us to have this mutual goal of best case scenario. What we were striving to achieve throughout this divorce is a friendship, because we both love each other dearly. We shared 12 beautiful years together, and I don't want to picture my life without him. I just don't want to be married to him anymore, and vice versa. So even throughout the management of that, let's call it a crisis, because no matter what, it's an emotional time. It's difficult. It's difficult in every single regard, right? Just separating everything and going through the motions and life changes and all of these different things. Today, we're 10 months out from the day that we made the decision, and he's one of my dearest, dearest friends. So just to say that it's only now, looking back in retrospect, that I was doing everything that I talk about in my book and everything that I do with clients from a professional standpoint, a business standpoint, I was doing in my marriage to address one of these high-risk scenarios. And so yes, it is intrinsically who I am and how I see the world. And I really believe that being crisis ready means that your entire team can identify a rising risk in real time, is trained to understand and to assess properly the material impact that it presents to the organization. So is it an issue versus is it a potential crisis? And then can respond in a way that doesn't just manage the incident, but manages it in a way that fosters increased trust and credibility in the brand. And that's where that lens of, if you are crisis ready, you have built brand invincibility, because it means that you can withstand or weather any type of negative event that may strike your organization or your business in a way that you walk out of it with even more trust and credibility built up with those who matter most to your business. If that makes sense.
It does. It does.
Yeah.
And I think what may be helpful is maybe an example. I know I've seen you sort of bring up different examples that are popular examples, I guess you could say. What would be one that you would typically share in one of your talks?
Of a company that is crisis ready?
Well, a situation where maybe not. Maybe they weren't crisis. I think the one I looked at that is very common was, I think it's the United with the guitar.
Oh, yeah. I mean, yeah, United's an interesting case study, because one of my crisis ready rules is people above process and bottom line always. United has the opposite culture where it's process and bottom line above people. So they're constantly, making gaffes in the media, in the news, dealing with issue management, because they have a backwards culture in my perspective. But if we want to look at something that I find, one of the case studies, a recent event that happened at the start of this year that is just so fascinating to me, I love it, is what happened with Crock-Pot. Do you remember that one?
I don't.
So at the beginning, do you watch This Is Us, or do you know of that show?
I don't.
Okay, neither did I. I don't watch
it.
TV, so neither did I.
Yeah.
This Is Us is one of the most popular television shows on nighttime television shows, or prime time, right now.
Okay.
It's been on for a couple of years.
Another planet.
But likewise, because when this happened, I watched it because it was a potential crisis for Crock-Pot, and I was fascinated, but I had never seen the show, never heard of the show. If you go back and you watch this 5-minute segment, so basically This Is Us has the father dies in the show, and everybody knows that he's dead, but nobody knows how he dies. So there's this build up to the storyline of how he dies. He dies because... So finally, I think in January, February of this year, they put out that show. And it's this 5-minute, brilliantly crafted segment, of television that I'd never seen the show before. And it almost brought me to tears. Like, it's beautifully, beautifully crafted as a storyline and as a production. So he dies because, the scene is he's in his kitchen at night, he's cleaning up, he's cleaning the kitchen, he's going to bed, he turns on a generic slow cooker. It's not a crock-pot machine. This is not product placement. It's a generic slow cooker that the storyline of this generic slow cooker is that it was very old and a little bit faulty. So he turns it on, he goes to bed, the slow cooker short circuits and sets flames to the house, and he dies of smoke inhalation. So that's the storyline, and that takes about 5 minutes to really reveal this story through and through.
Yeah.
Now, if we look at from the perspective of people, of society, of those who love this show and watch it every week, and they love this character. They're sitting at home, they're watching this show. If it almost brought me to tears, and I'd never even seen the show, imagine the way that it captivated them on this emotional level. And then their minds went, oh my goodness, I have a crockpot machine. I don't want my family to die. That is literally like the pattern, and it's not necessarily logical, but that doesn't matter because it had that emotional relatability factor, and now logic goes out the window. We can never trump emotion with logic. It's another one of my crisis ready rules. So in this sense, it's very, very real, and it instills this deep-seated fear that, oh my goodness, I don't want this to happen to my family. So Crockpot wakes up the next morning. They weren't even on Twitter at the time, and they realized that there are thousands upon thousands of loyal customers threatening to throw out their crockpot machines because they are scared that this terrible incident might happen to their family. And so they wake up. It's primarily unfolding on Twitter. It's being talked about. Dave Colbert, what's his first name? He did sorry, go ahead.
Stephen Colbert?
Thank you. Yes, that's him. He did, a monologue on it. It was in local morning talk shows. Like this news went viral, and people were very, very upset and very scared. And so this is something that nobody can foresee. This is us couldn't foresee this happening. They didn't even put Crockpot in the picture. It was a generic slow cooker. Crockpot could not have foreseen this. I talked earlier about identifying your high-risk scenarios. This is not something we could have identified. It's not preventable because you can't fathom that it'll ever happen. And yet it did happen. And it was a potential crisis for Crockpot because they risked these long-standing customers having a negative emotional association with the brand, and throwing out their crockpot machines and never buying from the brand again. So they did not want to lose those customers. Whether it was one customer, I don't believe in any one customer being statistically insignificant, as my friend Dave Carroll puts it. So whether it was one customer or 10,000 customers, there was this risk of this long-term negative sentiment on the brand as a result of this series, this show, or this storyline. And the way that Crockpot answered, for me, this was true crisis readiness. It was true brilliance. So they quickly jumped onto Twitter. They created a Twitter account, which was the first move to make because the story, the crisis, let's call it the issue, was going viral on Twitter. They then realized that a lesser brand would have potentially said something like, this is irrational. This is crazy. In the history of our company, we have never set fire to a house. Nobody has ever died because of a crockpot machine. Like, this is irrational and crazy. A lesser company would have risked either saying, this will die down. I'm not even going to pay attention to this. Or it could have just come out and said, guys, this is ridiculous. It's a fictional TV show. Like, come on, right? So we had the risk of either one of those two responses. However, that would have done nothing. It would not have served in either one of those cases. Instead, what Crockpot did was they understood that they could not come out and just say, this is ridiculous, you're being irrational. They had to validate the emotions of their customers. Otherwise, they would never have reached or communicated with them in an effective way that reached their brains, the logical side of their brains, because emotion had taken over. So what they did, and I'm paraphrasing here, but they basically went onto Twitter and they said things like, we are devastated with you. We can't believe this is the way that Jack died. Our hearts are broken along with you. So they focused first and foremost on validating emotion and relating to their audience on that emotional level. And then they followed through with, but we want you to know that your family's safety has always been our priority. And here is the proofs. And then they point to the logic and the stats and the history and the data that, our machines are designed to never let this happen. And as a result of this brilliantly intuitive and emotionally intelligent effective and quick response. They didn't take time to do this. They jumped on it the second they detected it. They were able to change the narrative. They were able to connect even closer with their stakeholders on an emotionally relatable level. And they did not suffer any what I call crisis response penalty, CRP, as a result. So I love this example because it comes out of left field. Like, you can never expect this to happen or fathom that it could ever happen. And yet they responded so brilliantly because they were crisis ready.
Such an interesting story. And yeah, it could have gone really, really sideways, something that's completely made up, but yet people watching that show, it's part of their reality. And I love the story of how they connected with them on their level first, and then reinforced once you have they basically went in, connected at what was happening, and then were able to change, like you say, the narrative. Such an interesting example of the work that you do. And this is what I love about it too, is such an interesting captive. I was like waiting to hear, well, what happened? And then how did they actually deal with it? I was thinking of, I have a family, and, right away I could feel the agitation and fear in myself, right? It's like, what are we plugging in or not plugging in at night? My first was like, I'm never plugging in a slow cooker at night again. I think I'll leave that up to the day. At least I could put the fire out or get out of the house while I'm awake. But
absolutely. And so think of that on a scale of, there's millions of people. I think it's 13 or 14 million people that watch this show every week. Like, it's absurd. I have the stats somewhere, so don't quote me on that. It might be a little bit off.
I will not quote you on that. But it's a lot of people, like millions and millions of people.
Yes.
It's like I used to be growing up. I watched, it was more the 90s, I guess, or was it? Yeah, 90s with Seinfeld and Friends and all that. We were just having a conversation the other day about how those were such a big part of our life and how connected we were to those. That's what it is today, but probably times 2 or 3. So massive amounts of followers watching these shows. And so the impact could have been catastrophic for the brand.
Absolutely. And like I said, a lesser brand, and I say a lesser brand, I mean a less crisis-ready brand, could have easily said, guys, this is ridiculous. Either it'll die down or just come out and said, guys, this is ridiculous, and it would not have resonated. It would not have had the power. And again, crisis readiness is being able to do this instinctively and in a way that fosters increased trust and credibility in the brand, doesn't just manage it, manages it in a way that builds that relationship, that connection on an emotionally relatable level. And it's a challenging thing to do when things are going viral against your organization, never mind when you're blindsided by that virality.
You're absolutely right. And I think one of the key factors must be having an organization with the right values. You mentioned United Airlines and their value system. Well, Crock-Pot probably has a better value system and set up where the customer really is first. I love how your first one is, humans before numbers. What was that?
People above process and bottom line, always. Yeah,
which is a great place to start. Tell me a little bit about what you would recommend for a small business owner to be thinking about, small to medium-sized business owner to be thinking about around their own crisis and brand protection.
Oh, great question. So there's a couple things, and it's a simple process that can go really, really long way in helping build brand invincibility. The first thing is to define issue versus crisis for your organization, because a crisis for one organization or for one company does not necessarily translate into a crisis for another. So, and I won't just leave that like that. I'm going to give it to you. So the definition, like a high-level base point to start from, crisis is a negative event or situation that stops business as usual to some extent. It stops business as usual and requires direct escalation straight to the top of leadership because it requires their eyes, their minds, their directives, their guidance, their decision-making, etc. The reason that it needs to be escalated to leadership and stops business as usual is because it threatens long-term material impact on one or all of the following 5 things. People, so stakeholders, whether internal or external or both. Business operations, the environment, if that's applicable. the organization's reputation and or the organization's bottom line. So we have people, we have business operations, we have environment, we have reputation, we have bottom line, and we have a long-term negative impact on one or all of these 5 things. That is a crisis. An issue, on the other hand, is a negative event or situation that doesn't stop business as usual. I see issue management as business as usual on hyperdrive. It does not require taking leadership out of, a meeting right away to capture their attention, because it doesn't threaten that long-term negative impact on, again, people, business operations, the environment, reputation, and or bottom line. So defining what an issue versus a crisis is to your organization. And then I mentioned earlier, so that's the first step. The second step is then to take that definition and to look at your high risk scenarios. So what are your most likely high impact issues and most likely high impact crises that your company is the most prone or vulnerable to? Every single company can add a few things to each of these categories, or can put a few things into these categories. Then when you understand the difference between an issue and a crisis, you don't get overwhelmed, or you don't risk getting overwhelmed, or you mitigate at least the risk of getting overwhelmed with things like virality. Something going viral against your brand or your business does not necessarily translate into a crisis. Issues can go viral and not threaten long-term negative impact, whereas crises can also go viral, right? So it's about understanding that where those thresholds lie and what are the most likely negative events to strike and whether they fall into crisis or issue buckets. Once you have those defined, then you can do what I call is a deep dive approach, and you can look at both of those columns and say, what can we prevent? So how can we prevent the preventable? And what can't we prevent? And therefore, if it were to happen, how can we be prepared for it?
Do you find that there's certain types of people that would work better on this type of thinking than others?
Absolutely. That's a great question. Absolutely. And the wonderful thing about having a team involved is that everybody brings a different dynamic. I mean, so I often get asked, how do I do this? How do I approach for example, I have a webinar series. It's a 6-part webinar series that takes registrants through the entire process of becoming crisis ready. So doing all of these things. And no matter the size of their business, no matter if they're corporate or business or practitioners who are providing these types of services to their clients, is kind of who this is tailored to, is these categories of people. And I often get asked that question of like, how do we deal with confrontation internally when we know that there's, 2 heads that continue to butt, and in a crisis they have to work together? Or what should we be looking for when we are hiring? What types of attributes, if we're very crisis prone or risk prone, what should we be looking for in our the talent that we hire in terms of attributes that would be strong in issue and crisis management? So it really does depend on the people. And it's what's wonderful about having a team, even if it's just more than one person, is the dynamic that brings. Everybody has a different touch point with the brand, with the business, with your stakeholders. And also everybody has a different expertise. So, your head of legal is not going to be thinking of the same risks as your head of IT. And having both of those brains at the table will provide you with a comprehensive scope on the different angles of different risk. So your question was more along the lines of, are there specific types of people that are better? I would say you want to look for emotional intelligence. You want to look for strong leadership. You want to look for open-mindedness, not closed-mindedness, because that's a hinderer that I see often is, that will never happen to us, or, that's ridiculous. We shouldn't even address it. For example, with Crockpot, as that scenario could have gone in that direction. But then you just want to make sure that everybody has a seat at the table that needs to have a seat at the table.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful, because I think there are people in an organization that their thinking is completely opposite to this and almost needs to be in order for them to do their job, because if they only thought of risk, they would likely not get out of bed in the morning, right? But yet the openness, I think that's key, in that everybody's got to be open to the fact that these things can happen and often do. And so it's not that somebody has to be always thinking about it, but making sure that somebody is, and the right people are, and that everybody's at the table. And, almost like one of these things, like we've discussed it, we have a plan. Now I need to go over and be in my risk world. And, and then over here on this other side, they're taking care of making sure the risk is mitigated. So just really interesting from perspective. It's, a lot to do with communication and dynamics of an organization, but this is a big one. And I think for our listeners, there's a lot of change happening in the industry, increased regulation, increased global effects happening. So no business really is becoming insulated from all these potential things that are happening. Data is out there in the world. There's all sorts of regulation around the movement of currency and money. But this has been fantastic. I think it's probably an exciting opportunity for anybody that's listening in bookkeeping industry, is that this is going to be part of one of the cards that will be in your deck. It might not be your key thing that you're working on, but it's partly something that you will likely be involved with or advising your clients around. And how does what's happening in the world of finance impact your potential customer? And so such an interesting conversation. And Melissa, you have a whole bunch of content out there, I'm sure. What would be the best way for our listener to get more information, to learn more, and maybe even connect with the work that you're doing?
The best way is to go to melissaagnes.com. That is the hub of, you can find everything there, from videos and podcasts and blog posts and free downloadable resources that will help in your crisis readiness, straight through to getting in touch with me if you're looking to have a speaker or an advisor, links to my book on Amazon, as well as that webinar series that I mentioned earlier.
Beautiful. And we will have all of those links in our episode notes. So if you're interested, you can just click below and you'll see it all right there. Melissa, this has been truly an honor to have you. And thank you so much for your generosity with your time and taking yourself away from the things that you're up to.
Well, thank you so much, Michael, for having me on. It's been a true pleasure chatting with you.
Yes, absolutely. And that wraps another episode of the Successful Bookkeeper Podcast. To learn more about today's guest and to get access to all sorts of valuable free business building resources, you can go to thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to The Successful Bookkeeper with Michael Palmer. For more information and to download the resources mentioned in this episode, please visit us at thesuccessfulbookkeeper.com. Thank you for listening.